Hello, we are
Hello.
live.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you all for joining us for this session where we're going to talk about writing for short games. And I think we're going to go around and introduce ourselves first and talk about and jump into it. So Ben, you want to go first there?
Sure, yeah. I'm Ben Wander, and I made A Case of Distrust, which is kind of a short narrative game, hence why I'm on the panel. It takes place in 1924 in San Francisco. I think the game's running length averages out to about 4 hours, and it's kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure meets a point-and-click style game.
Hi, I'm Bruno Dias. I'm a game developer, narrative designer, writer. I'm based out of Brazil. My upstairs neighbor is currently using an impact drill, so you might catch some of that. I try to mute myself.
Perfect timing.
The panel. Yeah, it's just everything's happening ideally today. I've worked on Where the Water Tastes Like Wine as one of the 30 odd writers on that game. I was the primary narrative designer on NeoCab, which you just heard from Kim Belair, who wrote for that game as well earlier today, and you probably there's some previews that are going to be shown for that game on LudoNarraCon. And I've developed Voyageur, which is a procedurally generated literary space exploration game that you can buy not on Steam, curiously enough. And currently I don't have a thing to really plug here, but I work in the games industry.
Awesome. Well, I'm Ryan Green, and I've been in the indie games industry since 2010. Worked for a little company called Soma Games for a few years, and then we started Numinous Games with my business partner Josh Larson in 2012. And our first project was a short narrative experimental poetic game called That Dragon Cancer. And it's about loss and cancer and faith and feelings and all of that. So that's what we did. And
I'm Amy Green, no relation, just kidding. I am Ryan's wife, so I worked on That Dragon Cancer with him, and that was the project where I kind of first started to think of myself as a writer for video games, maybe halfway through the project before I started to think of myself as a writer and narrative designer and not just a helpful wife. But then after we created That Dragon Cancer, I went on to do writing and narrative design for a few other things we've done that you've never heard of. Galaxies of Hope, a couple episodes of a game called Untethered, La Hacienda, forgetting one. That's all right. So all of our games have been short. They've all been short narrative. We don't even know what it would be like to write narrative for a longer game. So it's good.
sure.
So to start us off, we want to talk about like why are our games short, or what we like about making short games or playing short games. What do we think is valuable about that? Maybe Ben, you could start us off on that topic.
Yeah, I think for me, shorter games really, I mean, I didn't start out to write short games. It just happens to be that the stories that I kind of want to tell end up being a little bit shorter. And especially when you make a game that's narrative focused, like everybody on this panel does, the biggest impact I feel, at least in the way that my writing works, is to keep it short and sweet. Short is a relative term, right? I mean, my game averages out to 4 hours. That's double your average movie length, or maybe more. So it's not tiny. It's not like 10 minutes. But it did feel like kind of the right length to build up characters, to then have a climax, and then to end it without making it, seem too long. And me personally, just as a game player, if I'm playing a narrative game, I wanna be able to finish it and end it. So I really personally appreciate games that are shorter that I can play.
Yeah, it's like the biggest threat in game development is just scope. It's just like trying to do too much and just getting caught up in, that. And so when you have a short game, this makes for a really good limitation.
We can't hear the drill. I think you're fine.
No, I think you're good.
You can't hear it?
No.
Oh, this microphone is really better than I thought. It's a really nice limitation to keep you from sort of tangling yourself up in the game scope. You don't give in so much to the temptation of like trying to keep adding things and adding things and adding things. And when we talk about like video game narratives, you're not gonna get caught up in like the combinatorial hell of branching so much. You're not gonna have so many problems with like, okay, so in hour 1 of this game, the player decided to do X thing, and now we have to like be able to do all those possibilities, right? You don't have this problem of having to be really, really fastidious about closing off branches in the way that folks like the games like BioWare's games, Telltale's games had that issue of like, we're on the first act of this super like multi-chapter epic story, and everything that the player does has to sort of fit within the channels that we're going to be carrying all the way through the third game. So in a shorter game, you can be a lot more drastic about what you let the player do, because you're not going to have to deal with the consequences for that long.
I think that we have enjoyed shorter games. First of all, they're easier to fund, right? So if you're indie game development, a shorter game you might actually come up with a budget for. So that's exciting. But as artists, we think about the fact that we'd like to create something that's digestible for people. And I think that our whole generation grew up with video games, and we all played them as kids, but then we've gotten older and video games have kind of grown up with us and gotten into some more serious topics and some more mature content. And there's things through video games that relate to our lives. But as we get older and get married and have kids and have jobs and have these other obligations, a shorter video game feels like something we can actually get through. And so we like that, Ryan and I at least, that it's something that people, it's important for that Dragon Cancer. We knew really hard, emotional, difficult topic we were asking people to take on, and to ask them to do that over a period of many days. I don't want to sit in that kind of grief for 5 or 6 days in a row. So for us, it was important to sit down and experience it all at once and then be done. Because you're asking something of yourself. And I think some of the games that have grown up with us are a little bit more difficult to take in and to experience. So that shorter format works for that. And we like that it's about the length of a movie. Like no matter how busy I am, love to go to a movie for a couple hours. And I love that I can pick up a short game, experience it for 2 hours, and then move on with my life and not feel like I really robbed anyone in my life of my time for too long.
Yeah, I like to think of it, you said digestible, and it makes me think of, I love fast food, right? But I really want to present like a good meal, right? And like, I don't want something that's just like constantly trying to get you hooked on it, And so I like the idea of something that you can go through once and say like, oh, that was a nice meal. I don't need a lot more of it. It was enough. And so that's what I like about short narrative stuff in particular, is because it feels like a more natural story arc. And more natural like 3-act story arc, which is what I like in like Netflix and Hulu and those kind of like online television and movie content, is that it follows those arcs. And so the narrative becomes more important to the game, because I feel like if it's longer, the narrative can become less important to the game, because like it's not the core experience that you're coming for.
Well, and I also feel that if you were to make a narrative-focused game that was, many dozens or hundreds of hours, that would kind of get boring in a way, because like the repetitive actions that you can do in games, things like swinging your sword in Zelda, that stuff can be repeated a lot longer and stay fresh. I just feel like you were saying, Amy, I loved that Dragon Cancer. I would not have wanted to play a 60-hour That Dragon Cancer, honestly. And so the idea that like, hey, we're focused on kind of the story and telling the story, I like that it can be complete in like a short amount of time without overstaying its welcome,
Yeah, and you mentioned like the interactions like swinging your sword in Zelda and stuff like that. And I just, like that stuff loses its narrative significance very quickly. We see this a lot with like first-person shooters where, they have like these 20-hour, well, they used to have these 20-hour campaigns. And it's like, 20 hours is a lot of time for a story that is entirely about shooting things, right? because your character is just doing this one thing repetitively over and over again, it just doesn't sustain itself. It doesn't make sense. It's like if you sat out to watch John Wick, and it's the same style of fight scene over and over and over, and right, like how many fight scenes can you cram into a movie? How long? How far until it gets dull, right? And even if the gameplay still sustains itself, even if it's still interesting, the narrative just gets completely sort of shattered by that kind of repetition, or by kind of consistency of interaction.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, because I feel like with traditional like linear story media, right, like the director and the editor are responsible for telling us what to look at and when to go next, right? And so it's so easy to like, I'm the kind of player that if I'm playing Zelda, I'm like going to the edge of the map to try to find the hidden areas, right? So like I'm breaking the pacing of the narrative all the time. And especially when some character is trying to lead me, like I'm constantly fighting that. And so I think something about a shorter story is it allows you to really keep the pacing moving forward and really like narrow in those mechanics so that you can do that. But I think that's also, you know, maybe why some gamers don't really appreciate that, because they do like the autonomy that comes with being able to explore. And so I think that's certainly a design challenge when we're trying to tell shorter narrative stories.
And I think part of it too might be in complexity of mechanic, or in like kind of what you want to focus on. Kind of an in-between sort of mechanic and narrative game that I really liked recently was Sunless Skies. And that game is, that game is, but yeah, you should buy it. You should buy it. Yeah. It's true. That game works on a longer time scale, and I think part of the reason that it works is because you're actively exploring their world, and there's like some fighting, you know, shooting mechanics kind of in it. It's all from a top-down perspective, so it's not too realistic, but it's, you know, it gives you something to do rather than just playing through the story. The same way I feel like A Case of Distress was a little bit longer because there were like point and click elements in it, and it could be. Whereas if you look at interactive fiction, if you just play that in a browser, that stuff's really, really, really short. So in our next game, we're making a game that's like a city builder meets kind of story-based game. So I would compare it more to something like Sunless Skies. And the reason that we're okay making it a little longer than something like A Case of Distress is because we're doing other mechanics kind of along the way.
Yeah, I mean, Sunless Skies has kind of this like natural engine of pacing of, you know, you go to a port and you experience the story there, and the story there tells you, oh, you have to go to another port, do X, Y, Z thing. And if you want to follow that plot thread, you know, the next node in the story is going to be at that other port. But if you want to like go off in a completely different direction, it doesn't matter. The next like chapter in your story is going to be at that next port. So the game has this mechanical layer that is ensuring that there's a specific pacing to how you're experiencing the story, which I think is really, really valuable to try to make a longer narrative game work, try to make like a bigger world, especially when you have all those different little plot threads that players can explore. In Voyager, there's a similar thing where like you will get into a new region of space every so many planets you visit. So it's going to change the sort of environment at this very fixed rate. And I think that those kinds of things are very difficult to do in like very traditional big AAA narratives. You really need to be thinking very differently about narrative to be able to really achieve that and be able to sort of push things.
Sure. Well, it's one of the things that's interesting as you consider narrative design is that we get to really consider our players, right? And so we can think about like, oh, can I create something that's really fun for someone who wants to play it for about an hour, but that's still fun for someone who wants to and find these other things and dig into the richness of the story and find the peripheral details. And so, I mean, I like that the player controls the pacing in that way, that we can create paths that work well for people who break the rules, for people who want to play along and follow the rules, for people who want to just sit in something and really like go deep, and the people that just want to get the like overview, that there's a way to create for all of them. So in that sense, I guess shortness is relative because players can choose to extend their experience.
I mean, the analogy that I use is it's a little bit like a book, right? It's closer to books than it is to movies, where there's so much content there where maybe you're going to be doing a very close, slow reading. Maybe you're just skimming. Maybe you're reading it more casually. Maybe you're trying to get every nook and cranny. Maybe you're going over it with a highlighter. Different players are going to read it. Different readers are going to read at different paces. There's all those kinds of things. And at the same time, like, players surprise us all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I designed Voyager. I very much thought, okay, this is a game that people are going to be playing like in short bursts. You're going to be pulling this out on your phone and playing it on the bus for like 15 minutes chunks, 30-minute chunks at a time. And, it's going to give you about like 3-4 hours of gameplay, maybe, depending on how dedicated you are to finding everything that's in the game. And then I found out that there's people who play this game for like 20 hours. There's people who played it for like 5 minutes and said, this sucks. Obviously, but there's also people who played it for like 20 hours. There's people who have sat down with the game and played it for really extensive sessions, and that was never something that I thought was going to happen. And it was really sort of influential to me, like, oh, I'm going to port this to PC, and that's going to be a very different experience because it's not the same thing as a mobile game that you're going to carry with you when you're going to play in those little, grocery store cashier queue experience that you might have with a mobile device, right?
Yeah. I don't want to neglect to mention the people that play it for an hour and 45 minutes and then ask for a refund. It's just like a fun part of making a short narrative experience, right? Is we have all these like grand ideas for why we want it to be short and we want it to be narrative, but it also just in the industry we're in means someone could experience all of it and be like, that was cool, money back. Is that something you guys experience to any degree?
Voyager is not, Voyager has been refunded a bunch on the mobile platforms, but they have pretty like loose refund processes. There's obviously, like, when you get your statement, there's like, like 10-20% of people have asked for their cash back on their credit cards, and you don't really know why. You don't know if they played it at all, if they decided, oh, I don't like this. You don't get that information, and it just, it gnaws at you at night, and it stops you from sleeping and slowly kills you from the inside. But
writers are really positive people. Have we established that?
We love life. We're living. And it's just like there's this thing, because I get it, right? I used to be a barely employed 20-something with no money and a ton of time in my hands. And being like, if I'm going to buy a game, I want it to last forever because I'm not going to be able to buy another one for a long time. And, now as my life has changed, that I'm more interested in games that, like I said, to sort of respect my time and make good use of it. And I can sit down with them for like a couple of hours. I feel like I got a complete experience out of it. Like, I've seen both sides of that. But at the same time, there's this real trend in the industry of just sort of like trying to get so much value for money and being so obsessed with that idea of value for money in how games are marketed and in how games are talked about, that it kind of closes off certain possibilities. It kind of makes it hard to talk about a game being, this is a small thing that's very valuable. This is a small thing that is very precious, which was kind of how I felt about like Firewatch, which was a game that I absolutely loved when I played it. And it was like, this was like 2 hours, but it was like the best 2 hours of my week.
Yeah. It was good.
They were really good 2 hours.
Yeah.
And, it's a little bit different, for example, in things like film, where people are going to be like super excited and super into going to see, the new movie from the director that they really love or in the franchise that they really care about, and not be concerned whether it's, a 90-minute film or if it's like 4 hours or whatever they're doing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe now. Right?
Yeah, nobody complained that Endgame wasn't 30 hours or something, right?
My son just did a 3-day marathon of all the Marvel films. So
to be fair, those movies feel like they're 30 hours.
You need to stop. I think it brings up a good point here. In thinking about what players want and how they want to experience these games. I think there's like, when we as like writers and designers are coming to something like this, like, maybe at least for me, like, I wasn't as concerned about what people were doing as how they were feeling, because like I really wanted to create a space to feel certain things. And so in that regard, like, story was forefront, right? But I think many players come to do certain things, right? And so it's like, I think there's that contract with the player that we have to navigate, and it's tricky in that regard. And so I think when we don't meet the expectations of what players want, then yeah, they're maybe they ask for a refund. But I was just going back to that. What is the challenge for you as far as like storytelling versus mechanics, and like when you go into creating a short narrative game, are you going with the story first? Are you going with what you want to say first? And that's like your highest priority. And then the mechanics kind of flow out of that. Or are you going in with mechanics and putting the story on top of that?
No, I'm going story first and what I want to say. With the Case of Distress, that was a lot about taking themes from a bygone era and showing how they're exactly parallel to like our themes in our current lives and politics and things like that. It was kind of the opposite of the Star Trek thing, which is put it in the future and nobody knows that you're talking about racism. This was like, okay, put it in the past and it feels like it's far enough gone, and then drop some, important hints that, hey, maybe this isn't going to be over in the next 100 years. Maybe we're still dealing with this type of stuff. My game actually for a very long time didn't have the point and click part. It was only a kind of choose your own narrative clicking choices. And the point and click part came much later when people felt like they wanted to be more like a detective. And it actually ended up being the most expensive part to make of the game, because making a point and click area takes a long time. I think it ended up making the game better, but I still wouldn't say that that's the main core of the game. Really what it is talking with people, having discussions with them. And probably that's part of why it's short, because again, we don't want to do that for 30 hours. We want to have interesting conversations, get the point across, and then kind of move on. And especially people of our kind of ages at this point, I feel have other things to do, like family obligations and other stuff. And I might just want to get that in like a condensed form.
Yeah, I mean, I actually do start not exactly from mechanics, but from like structure, from narrative structure. I think is interesting about Voyager is that it became a game about space travel about a month into pre-production. Because originally it wasn't a game about any particular setting. It was a game about traveling forward and having a narrative that is structured around this idea of, you can only go forwards. You're always moving and leaving places behind. Right? That was the original point of view of it. When I was doing more traditional interactive fiction, it was definitely like story forward. This is what I want to tell and I'm going to use it. But as I do more and more of this kind of stuff and think about it more, like I find my ideas more when they increasingly come from a structural place of being like, I want to build a story that is constructed in this manner, and and I want to deal with these themes, and what kind of plot, what kind of narrative is going to like work in that sort of region. And it's because it's increasingly like experimental and abstracted, which is maybe why I don't get anything done these days.
Well, and that's one of the benefits of these shorter games, that when you're working on them, is that I think it gives you the time to experiment and shift your approach a little bit. That was experienced in Untethered, which was this quirky VR game that we made, and it was episodic. In the first episode, it was you and this radio producer, and the radio producer mostly chatted with you while you did other things. It was a lot of monologues, and after we released that, I wasn't sure I loved that. And so in the second episode, there were two characters in the car, so you could hear dialogue back and forth. I was like, oh, this is more interesting because there's dialogue and it's not just these monologues. And by the third episode, which we actually ended up losing funding before we went to the third episode, I was ready to shift my focus entirely and start to only have the narrative pop up in response to the exact things the player was doing. So it was very, that was the approach that I was landing on and becoming the most excited about, actually, is the approach that just was narrative responding, excuse me, for my daughter in the background, because this is what it is to be an indie writer. Stuff happening at the same time. But yeah, like that was where we were landing and moving toward, but we were able to shift quickly because we were working in episodes, and that was exciting.
Totally. I typically like to start with a space, like a spatial aspect. So like with that Dragon Cancer, like the first place we started in was in a hospital room. And then it's like you start to paint the wall with words, and then start to fill the space with sounds, and then start to like move moment to moment. And so for me, a lot of where I started was like, as an artist, I would go and create this space and then like kind of sit in it and then and then fill it out in that way. Which is hard because like it's rather non-traditional. I'm not asking you to do much. I'm asking you to just like be in the space, which I think in some ways just kind of goes against the expectations.
Yeah, I mean, that Dragon Cancer is very interesting because it's, you know, you're always kind of moving forward along the same path, and there's not really a way to fail that game. And yet I feel the reason it's so powerful is because it's interactive. Like I remember scenes, I probably shouldn't spoil different scenes of the game, but I still remember scenes in that game that were powerful because like I was the one pulling the lever, you know, and it just, and that game specifically, I think worked really well because it let you sit in the moment for as long as you really wanted to. And you know, again, like Amy said, you probably didn't want to sit at it for too long, but it became emotional because the game kind of asked you to move forward when you were ready to do it. And it would have lost a lot of that if that was, you know, just a short film or something.
Yeah, I think that's also like the balance as narrative writers, and why short games are helpful is because like there's a tendency to want to give every possible option, but when you give every possible option, the permutations become untenable very quickly, right? You're like in thousands of branches very quickly. And so in reality, you can only afford the time to really explore a few branches. And I think that like in life, you know, depending on how you view existence, right? There's the question of, did we really have infinite options, or did we really just have one or two options? And when you're facing something like a chronic illness, like we always, it was always funny because we'd have the doctors and nurses and they would sit there and they'd tell us all of our options, right? They'd list them all out. But then in reality, when you really asked them, they're like, we really only have one choice here, right? And they're like, yeah, there's really only one choice. And so I think that there's this aspect of like maybe valuing choice more than valuing like what our attitude is in the midst of no choices. And I think that, you know, when you have narrower games, they might not fulfill that need to explore as much, but there is a little bit of like asking the player to say like, how do you feel when you only have one choice? And what do you notice when you only have one choice?
How do you guys feel in general? I mean, we were just talking about, you know, short games kind of let you explore choices, but Ryan, you made a really good point of maybe you don't necessarily want to do that as like an art piece. For a case of distrust, a good example is there's a culprit at the end. You play a detective, you're trying to search for this culprit, and people would often come up and ask, oh, so does, you know, do your choices change who did it? And my answer is no, because the whole point is like the culprit is very important to the theme of the game. The reason why that person did what they did is very important to like the core theme and the progression of everything that you're doing. Now, the way you can get there can actually change depending on what you choose, what you say to people, who you choose to ask for information, things like that. But at the end, I thought it was very important to end in a single point. And kind of in a similar way of, it doesn't matter what a detective would do in real life, that the culprit is the culprit. They've already done it. You're kind of cleanup crew, right? Do you have like any theories of when you like to use more choice and branching, and then when you like it to be more of an authored piece?
You know, one of the favorite things that we experimented with Untethered that I loved, and I guess we got to be a little more experimental with that one, because you're right that with that Dragon Cancer, we're like, this ended one way and we had no control over how it ended. So for the player, this will end one way and they will have no control over how it ended. But with Untethered, it's a game that we use speech recognition. So the player just talked and what they said would change the course of the story, but we chose not to signpost that at all. So if you only played it through once, you had no idea if something you said might change how the rest of the story went. Like that, because in real life, you don't know when something you say might change the rest of your week. I don't know if I had been kinder this morning to Ryan, if we'd have a different month next month than we do now. And so I thought that was interesting, but players didn't love it because they couldn't tell when they were making choices.
I'm obsessed with choice. It's really kind of like what I study as a narrative designer. My favorite example of this in short games is like the maximum example, which is Isle, which is an interactive fiction game from Sam Barlow that he made in the late 90s. You may know Sam Barlow from Her Story. Isle is it's a parser game, so you type a command to do things in game, but it's a one-move game. You can only type one command. And there's this enormous panoply of things you could possibly do in that moment. And each one will construct a little flash fiction for you from that little individual moment, which is you standing in an aisle, that's why it's called aisle, in the supermarket, staring at the pasta. And you can pick up the pasta and take it home and cook it, or you can just leave it there, or you can move on, or you can do something completely absurd like attack a random woman that's just standing there, right? There's this enormous like variety of choices, and because it is a one-move game, it can actually supply all those choices, right?
Yeah,
because it only has to write one iteration of everything you can do. It has all that volume of things you could possibly be doing. I often think about choices in terms of not how much it matters what the player chooses, but how much it matters what the choices imply about how the player character thinks, about how the player character is encountering the world, right? Every time you offer the player a choice, you're saying, this is a plausible thing that the player character could do, right? This is part of their interiority. So you're sort of expressing, it's very different if the player's choices are like be mean-spirited or be nice versus be mean-spirited or be nice, attack, right? Those say completely different things about the character, even if the actual branches of what happens in the story end up being the same, right? Because you're sort of dictating what are the possibilities here, what is the internal world of this character, and how does this character think about the paths that they're going to be taking in their life, right?
Yeah.
And it's a really powerful sort of characterization tool and world building tool, I feel.
I think you're hitting on something there that I think is really important, because like as storytellers, you're used to just being a one-sided where the characters live inside our brains. And they say, we may be discovering what they're saying, but they still live inside of us. By inviting people into that, you're inviting them into the conversation of the narrative. And conversations are interesting because you don't know where they're going to go. Like we didn't know where this conversation was going to go at the beginning, but where it goes says a lot about us, and it allows us to learn more about each other. And not everybody would have that same experience if they were to go through the same conversation again. And that's why we were really intrigued with Untethered as a VR piece, is that we wanted to use voice detection to like kind of insert the character. And what we found was that what we wanted was everybody to play along. But what we found was it depends on the personality of the player. Because some personalities of the player, they just want to break it, or they just want to find the edges. And even narratively, they want to find the edges. And so it's interesting, like that balance between saying like a parser base, which was kind of what Untethered was in that way, versus an ABC and D. ABC and D still allows you to guide the conversation or to guide the story. But when you do parser base, it pushes it towards a conversation, and you have to be willing to like not know where it's going to go. And maybe like the moral of the story isn't found in the ending; it's found in the journey. But I think it's hard to like release that control as a designer or as a writer.
Did you figure out a solution for that? That's something that I always think about. And I remember, I think I saw a talk that you did a while ago about, everybody just wants to pick up the coffee cup and throw it at somebody else's face because it's this interesting space to explore. Just like you were saying in Zelda, you find the edge of the map.
Every game that has physics objects, it's just like the player
exactly.
going through the world, just leaving a trail of destruction.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if this has anything to do with short games, but I'm wondering if there's like a way to message to the player to like maybe take this seriously a bit. But is it like if you throw the coffee cup, it's game over, but then that's not really a choice anyway? Is it like, I'm not really sure what the right thing to do there is.
One thing I realized that we were doing unintentionally is that we were making the path where the player didn't play along the most funny and entertaining and exciting path. And someone said, reward the path that you want them to go on. And I realized that a little bit too late, because it is fun to write a response to the thing you aren't expecting. And it is fun to think of like, oh, I anticipated you doing that, so here's my catty response to you saying this thing that you told me. And so weirdly, if you start investing a lot of time in rewarding the behaviors you don't actually want to encourage, I do think you send the wrong message. And so I don't know if that's a solution, but it is something that we were starting to think of differently. Is like, okay, how do we actually make the path where they're collaborating with us a more interesting path than the path where they're kind of arguing and fighting with the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting if you look at the setting that you put them in. Like when you're putting them in the hospital room with us in a very serious situation, like most people just aren't going to be a jerk. Like they don't want to be. There's like a sacredness to suffering. And so I think in that regard, what really worked is the sacredness of that. I think when you put people in like a contrived situation where they're playing a radio DJ, like in our other game, like they want to figure out, they want to be the shock jock, right? And so then there's kind of like what character, what do they want to embody? And I think what's difficult there is trying to figure out how to nurture, like Amy said, reward the path you wanted to go on. And I think that like improvisational theater is like a really good place to study. And it's a place I'd like to study more because like they have rules on how to engage, right? And when you as an audience member come up on stage and they ask you to participate, if you are a poor participant, they're going to ridicule you, right? They're going to get you back on track because they have the keys to be able to do that. But when it's magic is when you add on and say yes and I think that maybe like a lot of games are based on competitiveness or combativeness, right? Like there's a violence to video games that's kind of inherent in some ways. And when you're asking somebody to kind of play along with you, that's more of just like a playground game. It's like, let's play pretend. Here, you be the Jedi and I'll be, R2-D2 or something like that. Like, I think that's a different setting. And so I think what you're inviting him into, the setting that you're inviting him into, and then like figuring out ways to kind of like yes and to what they're doing. So it's not like you're disagreeing. It's not like you're saying, well, that was a bad choice. It's more like, oh, that was a good choice, but here, let's get you back on track again.
Right. It's like, how do you make a game where there's only good choices to be made, right? Mm-hmm. Where the player's only directed towards the good things and the bad things don't never occur. They can never even appear as options. So we need to be wrapping up. What do you think where do you think these kinds of narrative games are going? Like, what do you think is exciting about the direction of it? Just to put a point on everything.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to like generated narrative. If you look at Inkle and what they've done with Heaven's Vault, I think that's a really good example.
It frightens me. I gotta look
at it. Right, yeah. But it's just really interesting the things that they do with, player choice and kind of how that impacts the state of their game. And at the same time, generating part of the narrative out of like, I think they described it as like generated a cupcake with like icing that they've layered on top, but they don't know what like the base is made of yet. The game decides that. I think that stuff is really quite interesting. And John Ingold, the main writer on that game, compared it to telling a bedtime story to your child before they go to bed. You can tell them the same story over and over and over again, and it's never quite the same every time. Sure, maybe the main beats are the same, but the journey there is what's interesting. And if we can generate that journey in multiple interesting ways, maybe in ways that we as writers haven't even thought about, the system is building for us, I think that becomes super powerful and something really only video games are capable of.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
I mean, you hit on the journey, and I think that's right. I think more than the story arc, I think I'm more interested in the character. Like, who is this person that you're on this journey with? And so I'm most interested right now in conversational-based narrative, stuff where like you have something you're doing together, but what you're doing together isn't really the point. Like what you're discovering about who they are is the point. And then in that regard, there's always something to discover. And there's always ways for the game to evolve over time. And I think like going back, I think Jason Rohr recently gave a talk at the GDC, like if we're creating like infinite situation generators, right? And if we can do that in compelling ways that are meaningful, then I think that can be really special. All right, well, Amy, do you have any thoughts on future narrative, what you're interested in?
I went to a talk once that I thought was really fascinating that talked about like how in traditional film you have these moments where the hero has to decide if they're going to give up what they want to get what they need, right? And that's watch some of these longer television shows, as you start to see their objective shifts and what sacrifices are they willing to make, and are they going to end up being this good guy, or are they going to end up being this bad guy? And I'm excited to see more narratives where the player gets to make those big, meaningful choices. We've been good at letting players make these peripheral choices while we make the big story arc choices. And I see the potential narrative has to let the player really make those big choices. Will the player sacrifice their own objectives? Will the player be willing to shift the nature of who they are and what they want and experience? Because I think that kind of choice could be really meaningful. And I think that kind of choice can be like a mirror where we look back at ourselves and go, so in this game, to become what I needed to become, I had to give up what I wanted. Are there some areas in my life where I have to do that? Because I think games can be more self-reflective than other media we consume can be, but it depends on how we let the player engage. And if we get so focused on how we want to tell the story, then they lose, I think, the joy of telling a story themselves, which is that telling a story changes you a little bit. And so if we sort of collaborate with the players and let them help shape the story, then it can change them and not just us as we create.
Yeah, I really like the description that Inkle gives of having as well, this idea of having like a procedural substrate that you layer a more sort of arc-driven design narrative on top of it. And I think that ties into this idea of like, how do we make these worlds, these story worlds that are really reactive to what the player is doing and that are really sort of deep and that act as a good sort of environment to drive the player through their little arc, that because there's this depth, this underlying sort of mechanical and narrative depth to these worlds, you can let the players stray more. A thing that Heaven's Vault does is that I'm pretty sure, I haven't played the game multiple times yet, but I'm pretty sure you can really reorder the narrative in pretty substantial ways in terms of where you go at each point in the story, because there's all that sort of depth grounding everything and making it a lot easier for the game to sort of manage, the player decided to go there first, or the player decided to go there first, and make those sort of like almost editorial choices. All right, we've got about a minute left. So to plug things, you can find me on Twitter at @NotBrunoAgain. You can buy my games at brunodias.itch.io. And Amy, why don't you go and do that as well?
Goodness, I don't have a lot to plug because I've been working on some stuff a little bit outside of games, some books and things. But nobody ever knows I'm on Twitter, so I'll plug that. You can find me on Twitter at Amy Green Comedy, because everybody follows my husband and no one follows me, so then I don't use Twitter much. But if people started following me, I'd start doing some fun and interesting stuff on Twitter. So. And
Amy is much different than me, so you will be very entertained.
I'm never mopey like Ryan.
No, I'm just Eeyore all the time. You can buy That Dragon Cancer on Steam and iOS and Android. It's on sale on Steam right now. And
yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at The Wandering Ben. A Case of Distrust is on Steam and Switch, and I think it's on sale for the LudoNarraCon. And the next game I'm making is called Airborne Kingdom, which is a city builder in the sky in an auto-generated world with some interesting story nodes to it as well. I guess that's like the quick pitch.
And absolutely gorgeous. Did you mention that?
I was going to say, that sounds amazing. Next time I want to pitch something cool like that. Thanks, guys. It sounds like maybe we could have talked about short games for a really long time, and we didn't realize that. So thanks. It's been a great experience.
Yep. Thank you.
Tuning in.